Hello, all, and welcome to a special replay episode of the Unifying Force, debuting replaying on Christmas Day. Thank you for joining us and taking some of your time this holiday season to spend a little bit of time with your Star Wars family. We hope you are enjoying the season. We thank you for joining us here on the Virtual Cantina Network. And we hope you're having a good one the same way we have a good time doing this little show for you. So thanks for watching. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Joyous Kwanzaa, other holidays that I'm sure that I'm forgetting. And thanks again, and may the Force be with you.
Hello and welcome everybody to today's episode of the Unifying Force. I'm Kat, joined by Gio. How you
Hey,
doing?
everybody. I'm good. How are you?
Great. And Dave,
Hey.
our
Hey.
Jedi Master producer.
Oh, don't give me that when I just blew the sound. So.
Oh, I wasn't the only one. Okay. I was so concerned.
No, you were not the only one. So
Okay.
maybe I'm on the council, but I've not been given the rank of master just yet.
Take a seat, young Skywalker. No joking. The Jedi Temple implies that you are a master, so never fear. Okay. So, Catherine, did you want to introduce this? Shall I?
This is your topic today. You take the lead.
All right. Okay. So, hey everyone. Nice to be back with our friends, and we're going to have a really good discussion today on something that hopefully ties a lot of things together, especially with the Force. So, if you've joined us in previous times, we're all about using the idea of the Force to link things together, seeing how the mythological, cultural, spiritual aspects of George Lucas's universe and the galaxy that we love far, far away has real world reflections, real world inspirations, and we can learn a lot going back and forth between this fictional universe that is so fantastic and escapist for us in Star Wars and the way we live right now on our planet Earth, and the various beautiful beliefs and cultures and concepts and ideas and communities that we have. Essentially, one could say a really good metaphor is that every kind of species within the Star Wars universe and all the different colorful characters that we have, that we've seen since 1977 when Luke and Obi-Wan walked into the Cantina on Tatooine. There's such a variety of individuals, and of course they're aliens, they're in makeup and costume, but what we're saying is these are all essentially people from various backgrounds, and they have their own languages, they have their own beliefs, they have their own motivations and agendas, their own prerogatives. And it's very similarly, everybody that we will experience and meet in our lives, you can say the same thing. And that's something that we want to really appreciate. And what we can do right now is look specifically at the Jedi and see how the Jedi Order, within canon and within the films on screen and the Disney Plus shows, has almost two sides that are very broad schools of thought about what the Jedi are. What is the identity of the Jedi? Are they a religious institution, which is what a lot of film critics and people who aren't really into the canon, into the expanded universe, and into all the material say the Jedi. It's a fictional religion. It's a monastic little belief system. Or are they a spiritual group, a spiritual order, something that is quite different to an organized religion? And this concept, this dual concept of how do we classify and how do we discuss these ideas and these beliefs is something that we face every day, particularly if somebody has a particular belief system that they follow, whether it's a belief in, nothing specific and organized, an atheist, an agnostic, somebody who's humanitarian, somebody who follows a particular spiritual system that we have in our real world, or someone who belongs to a more traditional orthodox religious institution. And what we've seen since the acquisition of Star Wars and Lucasfilm from Disney is a little more specific, overt referencing to the Jedi being one or the other, and it causing the root of some conflict, as we've seen in the sequel trilogy, with the way Luke Skywalker became so disillusioned with everything. So I understand I've spoken a lot right now, and I'm going to open it back up. But hopefully I set the foundation for what we're looking at specifically for this episode. So Jedi, religious institution or spiritual order? Let's go.
Both. It's they started out as a spiritual movement, but then once they created their own worst enemy in the Sith, they started consolidating and institutionalizing themselves, and to the point that you got to in episode 1. One of the things I found that was interesting about the Skywalker saga as a whole is that it's chronicling the history of the Jedi in reverse, because Rey at the end of episode 9 is like the ideal Jedi. She doesn't have any biases or preconceived notions. She's not going to indoctrinate people who don't want to be there. She's just almost like she might go on to be almost like a monk, so to speak, like share her teachings, but not like force it on anybody. But then you see how you move backwards in the saga, and then you eventually get to people like Luke, who indoctrinate people who don't really want to be there, but has a nice little academy. And you go back even further, and you get to like a massive institution that you have in the prequels, which is more subservient to the current political regime than it is committed to their own spiritual beliefs. So I actually thought that was really interesting how like Lucas, because he could have had the prequels start wherever he wanted to. He could have already had there be an empire and an emperor and just had it solely focus on had Anakin already be a Jedi and fall. But instead he did this other interesting story where you're seeing how the Jedi have, because the opening scene of, oh, these Jedi are going to go deal with this little problem for the Chancellor in secret. And people are like, huh? And I'm like, oh, I get what you're doing there, So I think it's a lot of both. It's like, I think that's one of the major story points throughout the whole saga. It's chronicling the Jedi's evolution to get back in touch with their being a spiritual movement, which is ideally the best type of Jedi and what they should be as opposed to the institution. But as far as the base question is concerned, I would still say primarily it is a spiritual movement that just kind of, lost its way for a few thousand years.
Yeah. And doesn't that sound familiar to so many things that we know in history?
Yeah.
And I think that's the greatest thing about how Star Wars parallels the real world is I think, you can see or purposely maybe Lucas is talking about how those things have happened. And I'm going to go with both as well, but I'm going to kind of cheat and expand a little bit beyond what is canon and look at the EU and look at what may go toward the canon in the future. Is if we get a High Republic trilogy that's going to happen, the things that are happening right now in the High Republic books and comics, is that's going to go back to a time before the Sith have revealed themselves again, and you can see how just absolutely dogmatic and how much of an organized religion the Jedi are at that point. Even if you look at things beyond the High Republic as stuff like Dooku Jedi Lost, and how regimented his training is, and how that ultimately makes him become disaffected with the Jedi. So it's going to be both, and it's going to be individual to individual how they get that. I think there's a great argument for what we talked about last week is Qui-Gon Jinn. Is yes, we see during the prequel trilogies that the Jedi Order is very much an established religion, but Qui-Gon is far more of a spiritual follower of the Force that just kind of tolerates and lives on the outskirts of
That's
that organization.
Mm.
Sure. Yeah, and it's like he still gets kind of sucked into some of the things that the institution does. Like he prioritizes things out like midichlorians, and oh, there's a Sith, we have to kill it instead of like finding out why you're here, kind of thing. But he is much more in touch with his the spiritual side of the Force than the rest of the Council is. And I thought that was interesting because Sifo-Dyas was the same way. Like he could sense the war coming, and depending on which continuity or expanded universe material you read, either Darth Sidious was the one who planted those ideas in his head, or it's just him being a genuine clairvoyant on his own right. But I like the fact that he, Dooku, and Qui-Gon were all like really best friends, like really tight. I do wish the prequels had leaned into that more. And the book Dooku Jedi Lost leans into that as well, or the radio drama, I should say.
Right.
But that, which is kind of what I like about it. And it's just, and all those ideas you see come back, and like by the time you get to Return of the Jedi, when Luke decides that, you know what, I'm not going to be that type of Jedi anymore. I'm going to be what my father wanted to be, the hero, the good guy. And then that comes back again in the Last Jedi, where you see like just how modest the original the first Jedi Temple was compared to the Last Jedi Temple, which we see behind Dave there. Like this
For that architecture.
literally gorgeous monstrosity of this massive palace right down the road from the Senate. So I like that, how you have other characters in there who represent different aspects of the Jedi throughout this saga.
Absolutely. There's so much of a spectrum of beliefs in every sense. You know, when we're talking about our own and our real world, or we're talking about the characters of Star Wars. And the one key thing to always remember, I think, is that none of these characters are fixed in a particular way unless they're portrayed as being incredibly stubborn and stoic. And so just like us, we can kind of go up and down in terms of our levels of commitment to an ideal, living our way according to a code. And that can be, you know, whether it's ascribed to an orthodox institution, such as a religion, or a spiritual way, a spiritual pathway. So I think it would be really helpful just to go over like the definitions that we have, that we use for religion and spirituality, and then see and compare and contrast. So I was looking into, when I look for definitions, I remember being at school, and Google was just having this little really great option where you could click define colon and then put any word, and Google would have its own algorithm to summarize and take the average best that they thought answer to the definition of the word. But looking into researching it this time for this episode, I found that they actually use the Oxford English Dictionary as the number one, and then number two is Collins, and then I think depending on which region you are, I'd say maybe in the United States, also Webster's definition. So I'll go with the top and most common one that is given when someone asks this on Google. So a religion is defined as the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. For example, the statement, ideas about the relationship between science and religion. Whereas the Collins Dictionary expands a lot more, and we can talk about this in relation to Star Wars very soon. Religion is a belief in God or gods, but the activities are connected with this belief, such as praying or worshipping in a physical building, such as a church or temple. So a religion is a particular system of belief and the activities that are connected with this system, which I think is quite a lot extra to the first definition, and definitely ties into what we see on screen with the Jedi Order in the original 6 Lucas saga. And as exactly as Catherine says, we see a kind of inverse evolution of the Jedi through chronologically. If we're just looking at the films from 1 to 9, the way things are swept away again in the sequel trilogy and the Order is gone, Luke is disillusioned and Rey is the new beacon of hope. And she doesn't rely on the traditional teachings that are established for thousands of years. And she doesn't even rely on Luke too much. It comes from within herself. And that's where we go into spirituality, where the definition of spirituality is much more about one's personal relationship with yourself, rather than something bigger than you. So the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul or psyche as opposed to material and physical things. So what do you guys think of those statements? And feel free to run your own interpretations or the first things that come to your mind when you hear these terms that we're discussing in relation to the Jedi. I think it'll be an interesting thing to go into. Catherine, do you want to start?
Catherine, you're muted.
Catherine, you're
Yeah,
muted.
it's kind of like yeah, I agree. It's like you're saying, it's definitely like the inverse, and we're seeing how we see ideas like this a lot, how real world religions have evolved over time. How they all, in a sense, all religions start as like a small little pocket movement of people, and then it just kind of gradually starts spreading. And part of the reason it does spread is because it continuously gets reinterpreted from generation to generation, and they kind of infuse some of their own cultural beliefs and experiences into it, so the story eventually changes. And you wonder if that kind of happens with the Jedi as well over time, because of how it's just so. Because you do have a lot of wildly different interpretations of it, even in the prequel trilogy, depending on which Jedi you ask. Like each one of them seems to be gifted in a different type of spiritual category, you know? And then you'll meet some who are, like, for example, unsympathetic to the clones' plight during the war, and then others who are very sympathetic and caring about it.
Yeah.
So it is true that, like you were talking about, how these things change and how that people bring their own interpretations to it. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that we're talking about like institutionalism, and you go in and Google has decided now that they're giving their primary definition to the institution of the Oxford English.
Absolutely. That was a great little
Like,
yeah.
we can't just pull from all sources over the internet and mesh something together.
Yeah.
No, we're going to the institution.
That's exactly
This
why. Yeah. That's why I
is- I
mentioned
think
my old
that's-
school definitions. When I was Googling as a 14, 15-year-old, it would be an average grouping of an answer. Now it's just, straight in there with one person or one group's interpretation. Yeah.
And that's kind of like how I see a lot of the Star Wars definition of this as well, is within characters, the arc ebbs and flows in how much of an institution they believe in or participate in. If you look at Yoda, for example, okay, in the High Republic, Yoda is on a leave of absence from the Council. Spoiler alert.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But Yoda is kind of off doing his own thing, and that's, educating younglings. Is he's kind of given the impression that he's somewhat disaffected with what the Council is doing. However, by the time of the prequels, then Yoda is on the Jedi Council, and I assume, at least in the presumptive leader is, of the Jedi Council, the Grand Master. So he is the embodiment of the organization of religion. But as the temple falls and Order 66 happens, he goes to Dagobah, and by the time Luke meets him on Dagobah, seems to be much more of the spiritual kind of. He's not telling him, these are the rules, this is what happens, this is what you do. It's feel the Force, do or do not. There is no try. He's there. And you see Yoda in that same place when his Force Ghost comes back in Rise of Skywalker. So it's and then where he is going more on the uptick towards the spiritualism. Luke, who is supposed to be on his teachings, does the same thing and goes to where he creates the Jedi Academy and becomes the organization of religion, and then.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Empire, it's like Yoda's being a bit contradictory, and that he's telling Luke all the right things. But the mission that he ultimately wants Luke to accomplish is to kill the Emperor, face down the Emperor, kill him and Darth Vader. And so it's like when Luke realizes that contradiction in the end there in the throne room, that's ultimately what ironically saves the galaxy. Ignoring the fact that Palpatine returns in the sequel trilogy for a minute. That's kind of, yeah.
Just for a hot minute. But
just for a hot minute we'll learn that. So yeah, that's kind of what saved everything. I thought it was.
We don't know.
Yeah, so it was interesting that he's. On the one hand, the Jedi do that, because my interpretation of it has always been that, it's not that Obi-Wan, when he says, when Luke asks him, why didn't you tell me that, you told me Vader betrayed and murdered my father? He's like, oh, well, from a certain point of view. I'm like, no. It's like, you didn't tell him that because you knew that if you told him that, it would not be conducive to Luke killing his father and fulfilling the mission.
Yeah.
That's why he didn't tell him, and he's just trying to talk his way around it because he doesn't want to upset Luke. And it's like, and so it is an interesting contradictory type belief system, but you get it when you go back and watch things like Clone Wars, where they really dive into the characters a lot more, and you can see just how much of a company man Obi-Wan is. Like, especially in episode 1, how he's just not listening to his master, that he has no personal reason to think Anakin is a pathetic life form, but he calls him that anyway because he knows that that's not something the Jedi Council are going to care about. And so it does make you wonder, when Anakin has his little meltdown in episode 2 in the Lars Homestead, and he says, Obi-Wan's holding me back. I'm like, yeah, he probably is, because when you see the way the way Obi-Wan is such a company man. So I love the fact that there's all that type of division and misinterpretation in the Jedi Order. And so that moment in episode 3 when Palpatine tells Anakin that, well, good's a point of view, Anakin, and he's like, oh, the Jedi are selfless. They only care about others, and the Sith are passionate. And he's like, what, and the Jedi don't care about their own self-preservation and retaining their own power? And how if you want to understand the great mystery, you have to embrace a larger view of the Force, not just a simple dogmatic view of the Jedi. And it's easy, because Palpatine is the villain, to just dismiss him outright. Oh, he's just being evil kind of thing. Which, yeah, he is. He's being evil and seductive, but he is right. The Jedi are dogmatic in that sense. And it's precisely because Anakin does not share their dogma that he sort of goes down his own path. And you see how even years in exile, on the one hand, has benefited Obi-Wan and Yoda, because they're just teaching Luke the basic tenets of the Force. But they still have that. It's like they're still hardwired to want him to do, oh, it's a Sith, we have to kill. It's like they're not really evolving from it in a way, which is interesting to observe that.
I think it's interesting because it comes down to our, as fans or viewers or readers or all three, personal interpretation of what we think the motivations are behind these characters, and what we think maybe the writers, George Lucas primarily for the original saga, and beyond into the sequel trilogy, what they were going for with their characterizations, or lack thereof, with some of them. With Qui-Gon Jinn, one could argue that in The Phantom Menace, he's given a very specific identity visually, which is fantastic. But in terms of character, there's a lot of room for your own interpretation of what he's going for with his essentially personal rebellion against the Jedi Council, because it's entirely off his own back that he believes some old but ordained predictive belief, the prophecy of the Jedi and the Chosen One, is something that can be realized. Because one could say that a hardline principle like that is kind of what you'd have in an institution. These are the rules, this is a fact, and we're going to follow this to a T. But then again, his entire mechanism and way of going about finding a solution to this great mystery, and then he sees the solution present himself with Anakin on Tatooine, is his interpretation of that. And to be able to have such a personal interpretation of something that is not restricted by rules and limitations is very much more going into the definition by anyone's term of what spirituality and spiritual practice are. Because there are specific organized beliefs, practices that are tied to institutions within a religion that are usually shared by one specific community or group, or a couple of them. Whereas spirituality is far more an individual practice. It's to do with finding a sense of inner peace and purpose. And Qui-Gon clearly has that. It's just never overtly stated. And the reason why I'm really leading into Qui-Gon, I know we talked about him in depth earlier, but the reason why is because I remember reading criticism by film critics about The Phantom Menace. And one of the main things they leveled at Lucas was, oh, there's no character development. There's no character building. It's all, flashbang, shiny new CGI, action, and bombastic. There's no depth. But I fundamentally disagree with that. And the reason why I do that is because of exactly what we're talking about. It comes down to, what do you as the observer find in Qui-Gon? He's not a character who very clearly says, I believe this, and this is what I will do. He just does it. And the ability to be able to be at peace with everything around you, no matter the restrictions and limitations, but yet still do your own mission without forcing it upon anyone else, is very much the definitive spiritual way. And that's how it's expressed in our world, in the kind of more famous, and then the more niche spiritual practices and beliefs. It's about one's individual peace and purpose, never disrupting the beliefs or no beliefs or different beliefs of those around you, but you have your own deep mission. It's a duty. I guess some organized religions might say it's a holy duty, but that's where the terminology can get clouded. And we see in the saga, terminology definitely is clouded. If somebody had defined what the chosen one prophecy was and what the chosen one could be and what bringing balance to the force actually meant, there would be far less internal conflict within the Jedi Order as we see in the Clone Wars. And Anakin would not have been so convinced so quickly by the avuncular Palpatine that, hey, there's another way of doing things and it doesn't have to be with all these rules and limitations. And you know what that means? You and your wife can be public about it. You can have kids. You can have a family. The Jedi won't let you do that. The Jedi won't let you suggest ways of improving the rule of the galaxy and the protection of peace and justice in the Republic, but I will. So what's really interesting is there's a whole cyclical movement narratively that Luke actually does in a fantastic line by Rian Johnson in The Last Jedi, does talk about this almost inexorable cycle of creation and destruction. We see that in the institutions of Star Wars. You have the Empire originally, which is the hardline institution. One must do this. You must stay in line. This is the order for all the inner rim planets. There is no other exception to it, which is why the outer rim and Tatooine are refreshing and free. So when we meet Luke, he's a young, impressionable farm boy, but he has so much potential. And that is exactly what we see reflected in other parts of the saga. There's the power and in-group who have the resources, the money, and the ability to directly tell people this is the way things are. There is no, it is black or white, there is no gray area. Whereas the rebellion group, whether it's the Rebel Alliance in the original trilogy, individuals such as Qui-Gon, and to an extent Obi-Wan, I would say, in the prequels, against the established order of the Republic and even the Jedi Council, and then back in the sequel trilogy with the First Order, who are the de facto new empire, versus the new Rebel Alliance in its different form but same spirit, which is the Resistance. And
that's where it gets a little muddied anyway, because like the First Order is supposed to be the new empire, but the First Order is actually not the official government. The New Republic is the official government. And then, but that's for another day. The question over here in the chat is Skip is saying spirituality always feels more pure than religion, and I want to ask a question to that end. Is that there are those that would argue the complete opposite, absolutely, that the religion is pure as well, but how many people have to belong, and how many people have to, when they have the same belief, and at what point does a common spirituality become a religion? At what point does it evolve and jump beyond that? In the context of Star Wars or the context of the real world, is it the bureaucracy of religion that we see as the impure, or does the belief itself change in some way?
Well, that and the adaptation of it as a mainstream thing, and the indoctrination aspect of it. You have all of these rules and codas you have to follow, whereas like with things like spirituality, it's a bit more loose. Like you can put your own interpretation on it and be more true to yourself. Like modern religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, bear very little resemblance to what they originally were, because as the cultures have changed over thousands of years, they will cherry pick which aspects of the religion they want to live by.
Exactly.
Because obviously, say men and women are much more equal footing in society now than say most of those three religions would have it back thousands of years ago. So that wouldn't fly today, but things evolves with the culture to the point that it doesn't really resemble what it was. And you look at, like, for example, things like the book of Leviticus talking about how all these horrific things you do to people who don't really follow or do this or this type of sin. We're going to boil this person, kill it. Obviously, we don't do any of that stuff anymore. So it's like, religion, it's sort of like it's a bit false in a way because they're only, again, they're cherry picking what they want to follow based on what the cultural norms are throughout time, whereas spirituality tends to remain a bit more, is more accepting of the fact that you're going to be not in a living in a bubble, because you could be traveling around the world and being experiencing all sorts of different cultures, which is why things like Buddhism is much more about self-enlightenment. So that way when you do go outside your own little bubble of your own little world and go encourage other people, you're more open to it and having a more rich experience from it, rather than trying to constantly rein yourself in to follow like a strict doctrine of things that like the way that religion will have it. So I do think that in regards to Star Wars, that yes, there's certain Jedi like Qui-Gon who are being more true to the Force, and admittedly, his apprentice Obi-Wan only agrees to train Anakin because that was Qui-Gon's dying wish. But it takes a while for Obi-Wan to actually see that Anakin is something extra special. And Dooku, of course, was being more true to himself, but became corrupted because of his desperation to set things right. And so you do see how there's that difference. Like the Jedi are so in the prequels are so caught up with the structure of their institution that okay, we can only take kids who are like young toddlers, and we can
terrifying.
they have to have no attachments. They can't have families. They have to stick to, and they're almost like you're training them to be like super cops, because each Jedi has their own thing that they're experts in. Like Plo Koon is an expert in the underworld, for instance, or Coruscant's underworld, for instance. Whereas if you're spirituality, you're not really doing that. It's not like there's a checklist that you have to follow.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's how I feel that in the original trilogy, despite the contradictions I mentioned between what Yoda and Obi-Wan want Luke to do as opposed to what they're telling him, they are a bit more pure, kind of resembling more of a spiritual version of a Jedi. Whereas in the sequel trilogy, you get Yoda is once again, and when he shows up in Last Jedi at the Force Tree, he's like back to being very pure of heart and passing on good lessons. And that the type of lessons which Rey will eventually come to completely embody by the end of the trilogy.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I think the Qui-Gon's the key famous on-screen example in the prequel trilogy, and I think what I loved about the episodes 1 to 3, and especially the Clone Wars, because it expands upon all the characters and themes in a fantastic and just more developed way, is that we see how Obi-Wan's evolution and character development is significantly important for the way events transpire in the galaxy, because his decisions about himself and the Republic, while being conflictedly following the order of the Jedi Council, go into direct opposition with the way Anakin wants to do things. But the people that we see who are Sith, apart from Palpatine in the saga, are all people who are iconoclastic. They want to be revolutionary. They want to go against the system. They're raging against the machine, which is why I was saying there's always the in-group, which is the institution with power, the Empire, and then the out-group of the rebels who strive for just individuality, freedom, justice, and to be able to do whatever they choose without things being shoved down their throats. Anakin was exactly that in Revenge of the Sith, and we saw that clearly. He was becoming more and more headstrong in his stubbornness to want that for himself and for Padme through the Clone Wars. And we saw Obi-Wan also have that, even in Attack of the Clones, because there are lines of dialogue where he's beginning to essentially back Anakin over what the Jedi Order want them to do, splitting them up, sending Anakin to Naboo, because Obi-Wan saw the way Anakin and Padme had that interaction. He knew what was going to happen. I mean, it doesn't take a Jedi to be able to see that. And one could say the chemistry was not the best written, and the romance is not the most natural and flowing on screen that you'll see in any film. But the idea is there that Anakin and Padme have this connection, and it's going to draw him away from the core, let's say, almost commandments of the Jedi, which are non-attachment, which is interestingly more a spiritual phrase that we use in English, but then also thou shalt not have a family or a partner. You let all of that go, which is very much more what we're saying is in line with a kind of medieval Dark Ages, and then going back to the beginning of some of the Abrahamic religions, a very strict set of principles where there's no deviation from it and no interpretation allowed initially, which is the very seeds of conflict, because every individual is going to have their own subjective view of what's going on. Anakin has that. He sees the galaxy and he says to Padme, maybe they need they need a new leader. You know, when they're rolling around the fields of Naboo, and she says, "What? Who's going to do that? Who's going to implement like this new way of doing things? Are you going to do that?" And obviously, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy because Anakin is the one who ends up wanting to do that, but ironically submits himself entirely to another organized religion, arguably in the Sith, and another very narrow dogmatic way of doing things as Palpatine's most loyal, meant to be friend and apprentice, but really servant and slave, because that's what Vader becomes. And it's interesting because Darth Maul, we see in The Phantom Menace, is a silent, cool supervillain who doesn't get much of anything to express himself on screen. But in the Clone Wars, we see his backstory and his story afterwards. And the reason why he was given to the Sith is because Palpatine did exactly what the Jedi Order do, as you mentioned, Catherine. He went to a planet and he just took children. And he just picked one and thought, okay, that guy's going to be my slave. And I will bend him to my will and shape him according to my ego, and he will do my bidding. And my grand prerogative is the correction of the great mistake and error, as we heard in a, unfortunately, preview material for The Rise of Skywalker, which is the Sith want the great revenge to not only remove the Jedi from power, but absolutely run them down and kill them all, which is an obviously terrorist extreme view, which Palpatine obfuscates behind his political career as a kindly old senator and then supreme chancellor. So it's his duplicity using the aspects of an organized religion that allow him to acquire even more power than he already has in the Phantom Menace as a senator for an entire planet. And all of these things tie in really well, I think, to the central discussion on, you know, what are the Jedi? Because the Sith very clearly are, just in kind of good and bad, that black and white terminology, are the opposite of the Jedi in that they are two groups that absolutely butt heads and won't get along. And Catherine, as you mentioned, in the original trilogy, it does seem like Obi-Wan and Yoda are hiding from Luke. The grand aim they have is to just kill Vader and Palpatine. But I would say that's an interpretation of it, because my reading of it is that when Yoda talks to Luke on Dagobah about luminous beings are we, not just this crude matter, that is very much a personal belief and a spiritual sense of purpose, that there is something great within Luke and within Yoda, but also between us all, the tree and the rock and the ship. And it's something that you feel. As Finn says in The Rise of Skywalker, the Force, it's a feeling. It's not something, it's abstract, it's diffuse, but it's expansive and everywhere. And it's inclusive. It is not divisive. It's not about you and he or she, us versus them, which is the whole central, I guess, understanding of conflict between what leads to war, as we see in our history and even now, and in the galaxy far, far away. Every single time it's, we've got the power, we don't have the power, we're going to have a star war to decide the winner.
So let me kind of stop you and interrupt you right there, just
Yeah.
because of a question we have,
Sure.
because of what you mentioned there. Is, you know, you're saying Finn is saying that, you know, the Force is an idea, and Han, of course, is, you know, talking to Finn. That's not how the Force works. Is some of the what's happened and creating an organized religion is that in that the people who are not involved in that religion, Han, know more about it and see and have an opinion of this is what's going on in the world. Finn is not involved in that religion. He's giving you what he's heard and what he thinks about it.
Exactly.
In kind of a removed third person, because Finn wasn't there when this was happening. Han was. Skip is sitting here is commenting, saying the whole purpose of the prequels is just to show how the Jedi get trapped into that organized religion, how the religion, the organization has come together, and the spirituality is lost by the council, which ultimately leads to its downfall.
That's
so
right.
so let's
Well,
talk on that a little bit.
I don't think it really shows how it happens because it's already happened. Even at this, like I was mentioning, the opening scene of episode 1, they're already at the point where they're just more interested in doing personal favors for the political favors for the chancellor, and that indoctrination and that code. Oh yeah, you have to be younglings to be indoctrinated. No title. That's already happened, so we don't really get an idea. That's why I was mentioning that it seems like the saga is chronicling the history of the Jedi in reverse, because we see, if you watch the saga backwards, okay, we get why they institutionalized themselves and became like this structure. But the prequel, he is right that it's about, yes, we see how they eventually get, in a sense, trapped by the Sith and how they take advantage of that. Because one can argue that the Jedi obviously didn't think that the Chosen One prophecy was going to be as damaging for their own institution. They obviously had a very different idea of whatever bringing balance to the Force meant. And so if they had been more open to, say, spirituality and more in touch with the Force, like Qui-Gon, then Anakin's journey would not have gone to such dark places, and maybe he could have balanced the Force in a much, more easier. Put it this way, like an easier way, like much less violent, and it wouldn't have been by way of the Dark Lord of the Sith winning. It would have been by way of perhaps the Chosen One defeating the Dark Lord and unbrainwashed. Like if the Jedi would have taken inspiration from their Chosen One, which is an interesting dichotomy as well. It's like throughout the prequels, a lot of them are breathing down Anakin's neck. The Jedi Council, they're like, oh, you need to be in your place, blah, blah, blah. But they also call him their Chosen One, but they're not really giving him any respect or interested in following any of his ideas about what to do, which is sort of this interesting contradiction there. So had they actually done that and listened to their Chosen One and been more spiritual and open about it than so dogmatic, then maybe the Force would have been balanced very differently in a way that would have been much less violent or damaging for the rest of the galaxy.
They wanted their Chosen One to fit into their dogma and to their organization, as opposed to adapting their organization to the ideas and the concepts of the Chosen One. I mean, nothing more so true than the meme of, oh, Master Anakin, is if he had been given the title of Master when he went on the council, how much further would we have gone down the line before he wouldn't have been so disillusioned and fell to Palpatine? I mean, I think that's an oversimplification, obviously, but
it's a good summary, though. It's a good way to round things up.
What happens in there is we kind of danced around it before, and I may be asking the same question again in a different way, but kind of real world, at what point does the spirituality, the spiritual belief of a group of people become an organization? I think, and again, people can argue with me and tell me that I'm wrong in my real world organization. I don't see Native American spirituality as having ever become a point of an organized religion, at least in modern history. Whereas others have, and it's followed by a large group of people. They have relatively similar spiritual concepts and beliefs, but I don't see it as becoming an organized religion like the tenets of Christianity or Judaism or of Islam.
I think it kind of happens when the ruling body, the ruling populace of a population starts taking advantage of it and using it to their advantage, like a drug. Religion is like caffeine in a way. It's like or tobacco or alcohol. It's like a numbing agent. It's like, because obviously the Roman Empire had a lot of power. Well, they never would have allowed Vatican City to have the power they had if it was not conducive to the Roman Empire retaining their power. Because like the Inquisitions didn't really have anything to do with religion when you really get down to brass tacks. It was about getting rid of political dissidents and maintaining their power. But they used the guise of, it's about religion and stuff, and to get people to kind of go along with it. But it was never about that. Because obviously, if the Roman Emperor had ever wanted to, if Caesar, Constantine, or whoever, they could have stormed Vatican City and knocked it over in a day if they really had a problem with the power they had. But they didn't, because it was beneficial to that relationship and that level of power. And I think that's how institutionalization eventually happens, when your leaders obviously follow certain religions and try and bring that to their own policies that they're making, and it becomes more mainstream at that point. They start getting more money, which allows them to expand the amount of churches they have or the amount of programs they have to reach out to people. Or like when you have people, going out on missions, so to speak, to try and reach out to more impoverished communities and helping them out in exchange for, here's what we're all about and why we're here type of thing. And it starts actively spreading. Whereas a spiritual person or something like Native Americans, it's like, yeah, if you're interested in finding out about it, they might share the story with you, but they're not going to go out of their way to try and push it on you. They don't have
Mhm.
clearly the cash flow to start opening up like a bunch of churches for it. And I don't think they're really interested in doing that either, because it's more like spirituality seems to be more about the one and at peace with yourself and how that works within the community, as
Mhm.
opposed to everybody has to follow this singular mantra and be almost like, I mean, people kind of laugh at it like, oh, cults, everybody wants to get, like Heaven's Gate cult, for instance. Marshall Applewhite basically brainwashed these people to turn them all into basically doppelgangers of himself. Like they have no sense of personality or individuality. They're all straight. Well, and that's a radical version of kind of what religion is more about. Like, here's the doctrines you have to follow, and you have to follow these mantras. And if you violate them, then you have to go, confess your sins, or you come like a pastor or something at a church often will give sermons about things that if there's strife in the community of some kind, if some tragedy has happened to the community, then they'll go to the scripture and try and bring comfort to people, which is really good because it helps keep people together in a unit, but it still has the overriding goal of trying to keep everybody following that singular mantra. Whereas more of a spiritual religion, like you're saying of the Native Americans, yes, it's beneficial to the community, but it's more about you can have more open to interpretation how you feel that for yourself. It's
Mhm.
not but so I think that does the big change happens when the people in power who have the money and the ability start adapting it for their own means, and that's when not to say that it's like evil or anything, or that it has explicitly illicit intentions. A lot of people who, politicians and stuff who take it think they're doing a good thing. They're trying to, oh, this is great, we can help it. But it's like that's not really what spirituality is about. Like a
Yeah.
spiritualist doesn't really care about trying to spread their belief all around the world and get and rope everybody in. They're not. It's not like they're going to go to say help somebody in a charitable manner and then slip you a bunch of pamphlets to try and, oh, so that's what you're really doing here.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
different type of thing.
Yeah. I think it comes down to dogma, and rigidity and an inability to have freedom of expression within a code or an interpretation of that. Because organized religions, definitely with the Abrahamic ones that we've mentioned, um, they have the spiritual tenets at their core, but then it's man's interpretation and forcible practice of them over centuries later after the fact that end up causing conflict between the group who has the knowledge about this practice and those who do not. And then, as we saw through history since the beginning of these religions that became institutions, those who were egocentric and were not about inner peace and purpose, social responsibility, contributing to civilization, not just themselves, bent these ideas that people were beginning to believe into their will, in the same way that Palpatine was bending an interpretation of the Force to seduce Anakin to his will. It's exactly the same. You could say that's what Caesar did. And when I say Caesar, I mean the great emperor of Rome at any point, because there were many Caesars in essence. Because Rome was originally had a certain way of organization that was not as dogmatic and controlling as it was when the triumvirate fell apart. There were three people who shared leadership, and it very quickly became just one of them. And he was the person who proclaimed himself as above everybody else, as Caesar. And then the Roman Empire felt a threat from Christianity, this new group who have a belief of sharing things and not being all about oneself, but being about peace within. And you lead by example. You do not lead by force. You lead by compassion and empathy. And that's what we see in all the Eastern belief systems, which don't actually have a direct term for religion, because religion, I guess in English, as we've defined, is very much about physical organizations and institutions of things, whereas spirituality is, as the definition that we found, is abstract. It is ethereal. It is not tied to material or physicality in any way. Whereas the materialism is what leads to people wanting to acquire wealth and power and hold on to it. And then they force people to do their way or the highway. Um, and interestingly, the reason why I actually said man's acquisition of this is because you could say like the institutions that get corrupted are almost always patriarchal. And of course, if you look at the original text that people are ideally meant to be living their life by, some of it could be interpreted as, very much man's role, and there's no mention of woman. But if you believe in the equality, compassion, and love that all these things started out as, that made them an idea that people wanted to live by, not just spread and force over others, you would have equality between everyone, between men and women, between people of all communities, backgrounds, and languages. So when people misinterpret it to an extent where they're forcing it on others in a set way, that they are egocentric rather than devoted to service of everyone and peace within themselves, they lead down that dark path, one could say, of acquiring stuff, being more materialistic, being more self-directed and egotistical, and then not wanting to share. And that's what we saw with the fall of the Roman Empire. And then they had a pivot where they thought, hey, let's embrace the popular belief that is rebelling against us in Christianity. And it became the Holy Roman Empire. And they shared power and had Vatican as one of their bases, but they just used it, again, to bend to the will of their supreme leader. And then we see that in Star Wars many times over with whoever's the overarching supervillain of any point in the saga is looking to corrupt and force things their way. And I guess, unfortunately, if you take a very superficial read on it, that's why the light side and dark side becomes a binary, and a duality, when really the force and the light side isn't the light side, it's just the force. George Lucas' interpretation of the force is, it is an essence that's within everyone and everything. But it's about freedom and peace and purpose. It is not about forcing anything upon anyone and acquiring wealth, money, and power. So the dark side is a corruption of the force. If we just don't use the term the light side, because then we get into the concept of good versus evil, black versus white. It is just gray everywhere, and everyone's in their own little sphere and spectrum that they can choose. The chosen one, ironically, had no choice, which is why Anakin rebelled in such a way. He was supposedly predestined to bring balance, to wipe out this duality, and yet the Jedi Council in the prequel trilogy purely wanted him to fit down their definition of what was going to happen, how it was going to go down. And if the Sith are back at the end of the Clone Wars, when we find out the Dark Lord who's pulling all the strings, we must defeat him, or else everything is lost.
Or we just don't understand what exactly the prophecy's version of balance is, because you will take the argument that Anakin, well, before the EU and everybody else that survived everywhere else in this, brought balance to the Force. There's two Jedi, there's two Sith.
Yeah.
We've done it.
Yeah.
I can't help that you didn't, think that that was what it was. I think Skip really summarized a lot of what was said here. What we said very simply is that point becomes when it is a forcible need to teach new acolytes, to bring them into your organization of religion, whereas spirituality is you will tell people about it, but it's a take it or leave it kind of thing.
Exactly.
So I think that's a really good summary, and I really liked, Gio, that you brought in some of the Eastern religion and how that is mentioned, because I think we're going to be mentioning that a lot more coming forward with the brought out there of a new Star Wars property, the Star Wars Visions, that there's going to be that is far more aligned with some tenets of Eastern religion that we'll be discussing in the future.
Absolutely. I think the key thing is that the Jedi aren't defined. It's open to interpretation. But ironically, the fall of the Jedi was because they did not allow openness to interpretation. And it's a reflection of human civilization in essence. And so every conflict is where freedom is not really allowed, but people think it is. And those that see that and want their own liberty and peace are seen as a threat to those who want it a certain way.
Well, and I think it's hilarious and funny is I see that in the Star Wars fandom personally, because some of the things that I enjoy about Star Wars are the things that were not defined by George Lucas or by the official Star Wars canon, that allow us to have our own head canon and things like Grey Jedi, but other people will argue till they're blue in the face that it doesn't exist and it can't happen and it's not a thing, and I don't care.
Of course not.
I personally like to think that I am somewhat spiritual in my fandom of Star Wars. Is that
Mhm.
I think there is a belief in a way for everyone to interpret and have their own particular head canon around why did some of these events that were not defined happen. So it's getting to be about that time. Wrap ups.
Okay. Catherine, do you have any final thoughts? And then I'll
Uh,
tail it off.
no, I think we covered it pretty well. But like you were saying with Gray Jedi, people arguing it like blue in the face. I say they need to come up with a new term because I would argue there's probably a lot more Gray Jedi out in the galaxy than there were Jedi. Because a
Yeah.
Gray Jedi is basically somebody who follows true to their own code, their own moral code,
Yeah.
and try to respect their own balance. Which I imagine if you're in a corner of the galaxy where you didn't meet the Jedi or the Sith, but you're force sensitive and are disciplined enough to be able to rein it in, then that technically is kind of what you are in a way. And I really look forward to Star Wars getting into that, like exploring the different types of Force users who are out there a bit more. I mean, they've hinted at it a few times, like in the Legends of Luke Skywalker book, and another, the fact that younglings are not born Jedi; they're just with it makes you wonder if they weren't found and were left there, what would they have become?
Mhm.
Because we never do meet like average people, like non Jedi or non Sith in the saga, who are like adults who have Force abilities. They never really talk about that, but they have to be out there, somewhere.
Mm.
So that would be, as far as the whole spirituality religion argument. If you have somebody who's kind of outside of that, I imagine they would be more closer tied into spirituality. So it'd be really interesting to see that feed into the conversation at some point with the content.
Yeah, I'd
Absolutely.
love to see what happened to Broom Boy if Rey doesn't end up finding
Exactly.
him and bringing him into her
Yeah.
own Jedi temple. Is
Mhm.
he's obviously got Force ability. He's not been trained. He's not been taught. So in canon, it's out there that happens.
Yeah.
But
You don't need to ascribe to a specific institution or order. You can have your own interpretation, which is what Qui-Gon wanted, what Obi-Wan needed, what Anakin tried to live by, but fell back into just being fully into an institution. I think Visions is fantastic, and we should have a full-on breakdown of that because then we can go into the parallels with Eastern philosophy and how it's more about Dharma and Tao, which are the terms that very loosely in English refer to spiritual duty and personal love for oneself and all around them, which is almost the definition of the Force on screen and in
don't spoil future shows all right now,
camera.
Gio.
Yeah, we got a comment from Spencer actually. He says, thoughts on, are the Jedi really keepers of the peace or are they warriors? Now, do we think that could be a whole topic for another episode, or do we want to share our thoughts on that now?
I would totally save that for an entire separate show because
Yeah,
I
okay.
can talk.
There's
I
so
think
many.
you've given us the new topic, Spencer. Thank you. We're not ignoring you, but
Yeah,
not now. Again, for all things virtual cantina all the time. Find
on
us on
demand.
absolutely on demand. That's one of the things is, maybe this time isn't the time that you have free to watch us. I appreciate those of you who are, but
Yeah, thank
you
you.
can always get this show. You can get the Jedi archives. You can get all of those, the virtual cantina, the speaker series, select things from the happy hour. Some of the things at the happy hour stay in the happy hour. So you got to show
Hmm.
up in person because we're not
It's a bit of
recording
a
and broadcasting that stuff.
little bit of a Fight Club situation there.
That's exactly right. So, and I don't think I have a slide for this one, but check us out absolutely over on the TeePublic site where you can access t-shirts and cool fun stuff. Like I think Gio's wearing his right
I
there.
am. There we go.
There it
So
is.
that's
The
Virtual Cantina,
Unifying Force
Unifying
t-shirt.
Force.
And you can find ones for the new properties, the not so virtual cantina that will be at Celebration, and all of those other things. So, friends, I think that's what we have for today.
Yeah.
And I will say, may the Force be with you all.
Thank you. The Unifying Force is the way, and may the Force be with us all.